This isn't a Warner Brothers movie, is it? Okay, good. I love music. I'm sure most of you love music. I mean, we're all human, right? Except for that one dog who knows how to log into YouTube and leaves comments on my videos. I know you're watching. Please stop. Music has been an integral part of film since before talking was. Music has been an integral part of reality since, before that. If you love music as much as I do, half as much as I do, boy, do I have a film for you. I'm here to talk about what I think is the greatest film ever made about music. I'm not so bold as to say that this is the greatest film ever made about a musician. I think there have been so many movies where the main characters are musicians, fictional or not, that at this point, I'd have to sift through a lot of movies to really make that call. But as far as being a love letter to music in general, this one can't be beat. That Boy Meets World review got me thinking about Mr. Feeney, about how he's a great teacher, sort of the gold standard of teaching for a lot of people. But then I started thinking of the great teachers of cinema, and I remembered Glenn Holland, and this movie that I truly, deeply love. And I don't know how to talk about it 100% objectively, because I don't just love the main character, his passion, and what he goes through. I can relate to it. There's the music, of course. I love music, I sing music, I play music, I consume music at a rate that some would find off-putting. I even used to write music. And if it weren't for copyright laws, there'd be a lot more music on this channel that wasn't stock bullshit. I'm passionate about music. But there's also this feeling that many of us have that there's untapped potential in us that we never got the chance to tap. That there's a mark we're supposed to make that we never got to make, and that time is slowly but surely running out. And that every time we turn towards this potential idea, something else comes up and we have to put it on the back burner again and again and again. Until one day, we wake up and we feel like our entire lives have gone by. And no one will ever remember us for that thing we vaguely remember wanting to do. To be so long ago. So join me as I talk about the music of one man's life and how it relates to ours. I'm here today to talk about Mr. Holland's Opus. So before we begin, this will be one of those videos where I recommend the movie first before giving out spoilers. I'll give you a warning when the time comes. I'd like you to meet Glenn Holland, a road musician turned high school music teacher. Why did he change jobs? Because he has a wife, probably. Mr. Holland wants to create a piece of music that he will be remembered for forever. But over the course of the film, life keeps getting in the way. He's a busy teacher, he starts a family, buys a home, he just doesn't get any slack. And so this dream of his becomes a memory. But in its place, something interesting happens. He becomes great at teaching. He changes the lives of his students, and vice versa. Mr. Holland's Opus was directed by Stephen Herrick, a fact which, in and of itself, is astounding. If you look up this guy's filmography, this movie very clearly stands out. That's not necessarily a bad thing. He's directed some very fun movies like The Mighty Ducks and Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, and he's also directed movies like The Chaperone. Yeah.
I'm the chaperone.
He's directed enough other good stuff that he's absolutely established, but this one takes it to a whole nother level. Because Mr. Holland's Opus, despite how simple the premise may seem, is actually an epic. It's a low-key epic though, because the way it's told is almost segmented. The overarching plot hides behind these smaller plots. There's the segment where he learns how to reach the students and teaches Gertrude how to play the clarinet, the segment where he teaches Terrence Howard how to bang a drum. There's 2 different story arcs involving his son for reasons I won't spoil for you till later, and so on and so forth. And the film being presented this way really is a net positive because all of these things really do create a movie that is the sum of its parts. Mr. Holland grows a little bit from each experience we see him go through, creating a 30-year-long story centered around a music teacher who we get to know intimately over the course of 2.5 hours. And let me tell you, this film has some of the best aging makeup I've ever seen. Richard Dreyfuss was pushing 50 when this movie was made, and so they had to de-age him to play young Mr. Holland. And they didn't use any de-aging software, obviously that didn't exist then, so they somehow made him look younger with effects makeup. And it's mind-blowing. It's easy to make someone look older. It's a lot harder to make them look younger. Or I could be completely wrong, and Richard Dreyfuss just looked amazing for his late 40s. And yeah, Terrence Howard is in Mr. Holland's Opus. So is Olympia Dukakis and a pre-Fargo William H. Macy. He's credited as W.H. Macy in the credits of this film, and he's great as the vice principal. But of course, Richard Dreyfuss as Mr. Holland and Glenn Headley as his wife Iris steal the show. I love these two. They're pretty much great in everything that they're in. But this is arguably the greatest role Richard Dreyfuss ever played. I say arguably more to cover my ass than anything because I have not seen every role he's been in. But I also haven't seen one so far that I'd put above this one. He absolutely kills it as Glenn Holland, and he's a normal guy in it. Sometimes the realistic everyman roles are the best ones. He was nominated for this role, and he deserved to be. The same can be said for Glenn Headley, who again kills it as Mrs. Holland. She really does bring it, and we see these two go through plenty of ups and downs. And again, everything about these performances feels very real, and their dynamic with each other feels like a real marriage. But the real story behind the segments of the film is that Glenn Holland wants to compose a truly great piece of music. Something that he will be remembered by forever. A legacy. But real life keeps getting in the way. I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who don't overthink what sort of mark they'll leave on the world, but I am not one of those people. I found in Mr. Holland a representation in film of how my life has gone versus how I thought it would turn out. I'm going to talk more about this in detail later, but suffice it to say that this movie truly brings that feeling to life for me. It's one of those films that asks what the measure of a man's life is. Alright, so let's talk about music. This film is an absolute love letter to music. I think we see a lot of movies where music serves to advance the plot. There's two in particular that come to mind. The musical, a genre which requires the highest suspension of disbelief because people don't just randomly break into song in real life, and the musician biopic, which is like a regular biopic but about a musician, and so that musician's music is used. But Mr. Holland's Opus is a movie about music. Not one where the music's primary motive is moving the story along. Although it does that too, to an extent. This movie is about music moving normal people in daily life. You're going to see kids be inspired by music, deeply love music, even be frustrated and struggle and not completely understand music. I don't think I've ever seen another movie truly capture the emotional highs and lows of music quite like this one. Which is a shame because if you look up best movies about music, this film does not appear on a fucking single one of these lists. Oh my god! A couple other things to sell you on with this movie. Well, the music in the movie is great. It's got some great songs overlaying some of the montages, but also has an incredible scene featuring Beethoven's 7th Symphony, and another scene involving a John Lennon song, and I'm not gonna spoil which one yet, but it's amazing. The soundtrack in this movie fucking slaps. To say nothing of the actual score of the film, which is Mr. Holland's actual opus. Michael Kamen scored this one, and again, this one sort of sticks out in his music credits. If I didn't know any better, would I have guessed that the man who wrote the score of Mr. Holland's Opus also scored Highlander, Hudson Hawk, and The Iron Giant? Definitely not. Not to go off on a tangent, but if you haven't seen Hudson Hawk, you really should. I just watched it for the first time last year, and it's one of the strangest movies I've ever seen. I really liked it. Anyway, if I had one critique of Mr. Holland's Opus, and it's a very minor one, it would be that as it takes you through each era, it kind of does this pop culture transitional thing where it shows you stuff that was going on at the time to try and make you go, oh hey, I remember that. Like, when it gets to the late 60s and early 70s, it starts playing Vietnam War footage. In the late 70s and 80s, it's all disco and punk rock stuff. In the 90s, there's rap and openly gay couples. This is such an outdated way of moving a movie forward in time. This was like the 90s version of the spinning newspaper from the 30s and 40s. Just showing the banners of each graduating class should have been enough. This movie did come out in 1995, so the boomers who were watching it back then were probably like, oh yeah, I remember that. But very few people watching it now are going to be like, oh yeah, I remember that. Again, a very, very minor critique, but these parts made me laugh on the rewatch. Alright, so there's the recommendation. We got spoilers coming up. Go watch the movie and report back for the review. Took you fucking long enough. The first segment of the film is Glenn Holland's start as the music teacher at John F. Kennedy High School in 1964, a job that he took because he needed something steady. Unfortunately, this means he won't have time for writing his own music. The film actually opens with the piece of music that becomes his magnum opus, the American Symphony. And I really like this scene because the ending brings this opening full circle. Anyway, Mr. Holland doesn't like his job. He's out of his element, he doesn't know how to teach in a way that's effective or interesting, and the principal notices this. She challenges him to find his compass and become a better teacher. And he does this in two ways. First, in his music appreciation class, he goes off the syllabus and connects with the kids by teaching them scales through popular music, which at the time was rock and roll. There is a scene here that makes me laugh every time I watch it. When William H. Macy hears the rock music, he goes running down the hall so fast that his feet slide. It's hilarious. Like, this guy heard the music from all the way down the hall and just ran so fast that his shoes left skids on the floor. Secondly, he connects on a personal level to Gertrude Lang, a girl in his band class who puts all of her stock and self-worth into playing the clarinet. Unfortunately, she's not very good, and this weighs on her very heavily.
Miss Lang, all I make is noise. It takes a lot of work to learn a musical instrument.
I just want to be good at something. My sister's got a ballet scholarship to go to Juilliard, and my brother's going to Notre Dame on a football scholarship. My mother's won the blue ribbon for watercolors at the state fair so many times they've retired the category. My father's got the most beautiful voice. I'm the only one in my family who's... I just can't...
So Mr. Holland finally gets her to play with confidence by getting her to feel what she's playing, not read it.
When you look in the mirror, what do you like best about yourself?
My hair.
Why?
My father always says that it reminds him of a sunset.
Play the sunset.
This is the turning point, because now he's good at his job and takes pride in it. Then, of course, Mr. Holland teaches Terrence Howard how to play the bass drum so he can stay in track. I really like the scene where the gym coach challenges him to stay on the kid.
Bill, how am I supposed to keep a kid in the band if he can't play an instrument?
You teach him. You're telling me that you cannot teach a willing kid like Lou Russ to bang a drum or something?
I tried.
No, you teach him.
I tried and I can't.
Well, then you're a lousy teacher.
Then later on in the movie, Mr. Holland uses this kid's death to teach another student music appreciation. Now, you may be wondering, how is this moment supposed to teach this kid anything about music? I remember thinking that when I first saw this. But then I realized, duh, it's because they're playing taps on the trumpet. You know, one of the most emotional pieces of music there is, played at the funerals of fallen soldiers. That's pretty ingenious. Then there's the Rowena segment. This is the segment where if they had fucked one thing up, it would have fucked up the entire movie. And despite what some people on the internet seem to think of this part of the film, I think this portion of the film was handled with absolute class. So Mr. Holland develops a bond with a student who wants to be a singer and eventually decides to try out Broadway. This student, Rowena, is kind of obsessed with Mr. Holland, though. And the movie is very careful to make sure that Mr. Holland is not obsessed with her in the same way. Yes, she kind of has a crush on her music teacher who's too old for her, but that crush is fueled by the fact that A, she's a dumb, confused kid, and B, she is insightful enough to see that Mr. Holland has a musical talent that runs a lot deeper than his profession. What she does for Mr. Holland on his end, though, is different. She fills his head back up with the dreams he had of being a famous musician. That's what she does for him. And so when she asks him to come with her, the temptation on his end is that this is finally possibly his chance at the dreams he used to have and still has. That part of him isn't completely dead. This is an out that he now finally has in middle age. But he overcomes this temptation and makes the right decision by choosing not to leave his family. If this hadn't been conveyed in the exact way that it was, it would have fucked up the entire movie, but it was handled decently. This segment brings him a giant step closer to appreciating what he has. Now, while all this is happening, Mr. Holland and Iris have their son, Cole, named after Mr. Holland's John Coltrane story, which I loved. And then, in an ironic twist that this movie actually had the balls to pull off really well, Cole is deaf. The musician's son is deaf. This news leads to one of the most well-acted scenes in the movie, as Mr. Holland talks about Beethoven's deafness to his class while the 7th Symphony plays. This is one of those scenes that fires on every cylinder.
Mr. Holland? Mr. Holland? If he couldn't hear, how would he even know what the notes were? Like, if he never heard a C, how do you know that's what he wanted played? Well, Beethoven wasn't born deaf.
And I love that Mr. Holland has a fundamental issue connecting with his son for most of the movie. This makes for a lot of great scenes, and it isn't just resolved in one segment. It takes most of the movie. And every one of his arguments with Iris feels so real. This is a realistic marriage. Richard Dreyfuss and Glenn Headley are so good together in every scene they're in.
You go off to school every day with all of your children who are normal. I can't talk to my son. I don't know what he wants or what he thinks or what he feels. I can't tell him that I love him. I can't tell him who I am. I want to talk to my son. I don't care what it costs. I don't care what stupid doctor says is right or wrong. I want to talk to my son.
And the tragedy of him connecting with his students more than his son, because they have the shared ability to hear the things that he loves, feels inevitable and tragic. All of this finally comes to a head with the murder of John Lennon, during which Cole finally signs his father off. And Mr. Holland realizes that he hasn't been doing right by his son. And so he apologizes in a very touching way. He puts on a music light show for Cole's school, and at the end, he dedicates and sings John Lennon's Beautiful Boy to his son in what is possibly the best scene in the film. Richard Dreyfuss's acting in this scene is incredible. We can see that he's nervous, sweating, and out of his element, signing while singing, and all just to convey to his son how much he loves him through music that he can't hear but can see. Also, the fact that they kept the entire song is awesome. You know how movies are. Unless it's the end credits, they tend to abridge songs or do a time lapse. But Mr. Holland performs this song in its entirety because that's what would have happened in real life.
Beautiful, 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 Cole.
And so in the final segment, Mr. Holland becomes the victim of something that many Americans fall victim to: budget cuts. Mr. Holland, after teaching for 30 years, gets shit-canned. Now, there are two sides of the situation, and both suck. On one hand, Mr. Holland is right, to an extent. Cutting the arts did limit a kid's exposure to them during the time this movie takes place, which was before the internet. And of course, it is Mr. Holland's ass. He absolutely has the right to be pissed about it and fight it, which he does. Exposing kids to art brings out the artist in kids who are meant to make art. But on the other hand, I'd like to point out that this is not the principal's fault. The story of a school board making budget cuts and principals needing to spare the crucial staff and cut the arts is a story that has been happening for a while now. If I really wanted to play devil's advocate, I could say that Gene just saved these kids from picking a major that would put them in crippling debt for the rest of their lives. But maybe I shouldn't go that far. And so, Mr. Holland, who had to bite the bullet once so long ago and take a job that he didn't really enjoy, is now getting let go of the only steady job he's had that he's worked at for 30 years. It's like the failure on top of the failure. But then, something incredible happens. Every person in the community who loves Mr. Holland forms an assembly to see him off. Students from every year he taught show up, including Gertrude Lang, who is now the governor. And I'm not gonna cry. They give him the greatest gift they could give him, and the greatest ending this movie could have.
Mr. Holland, we would now like to give something back to you and to your wife, who along with you has waited 30 years for what we're about to hear. If you will, would you please come up here and take this baton and lead us in the first performance ever of the American Symphony by Glenn Holland.
They perform the American Symphony by Glenn Holland. And the film ends with one of the most cathartic shots of all time. A man who waited his entire life to make his mark and finally did. Funny note about the American Symphony, I've always liked it. However, I read somewhere while working on this review that it sounds like a song used in an NFL promo, and now I can't get that out of my head. Because it kinda does. Also, he totally stole that ending from the Beatles' A Day in the Life. What the fuck? But hey, Mr. Holland's Opus is fantastic and one of my favorites. Again, it's tough to talk about this movie objectively because of how personal it's always felt to me. Music is a part of my life. I sing, I play piano, I have a CD collection that would rock your face off, and when I was young, people like Mr. Holland continually taught and inspired me. But as I got older, I identified more with Mr. Holland's uncertainties about the future and his own legacy. I'm sure many of us do. And it's worth being concerned about these things. Life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans is really emphasized as a core theme in this movie. But at least in some of our cases, we'll create a legacy where we least expect it.
Look around you. There is not a life in this room that you have not touched. And each one of us is a better person because of you. We are your symphony, Mr. Holland. We are the melodies and the notes of your opus, and we are the music of your life.
It may not be the one we first hoped for. It may not even be like Mr. Holland's, but hopefully we will still have our moment in the sun. So, say it with me. That's good music. Gotcha. That's good movie. Folks, thanks for your patience, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, subscribe, and consider throwing a buck into the Patreon. I am also involved in a sketch comedy show. The link is in the description. This video is dedicated to 3 music teachers who were like a Mr. Holland to me. Mrs. D, Mr. Travis, and Mrs. New. Oh, funny story about the scene where it's revealed that his son is deaf. When I first watched this movie with my dad, he said, the worst thing happened to his kid that could happen to the son of a musician. And I said to my dad, he's dead?